You're watching The Legal Breakdown. So, Glenn, we've got our very first guilty plea in Georgia. That's the Fulton County case. Trump's co-defendant, his name is Scott Hall, had pleaded guilty in that trial, and he'll take a plea agreement with prosecutors. So, first things first here, is this a flip?
Yeah, Brian, we've got a flipper, and then there were 18. We started with 19 co-defendants in the RICO conspiracy case that Fani Willis has brought down in Georgia. We're down to 18. And flipping is a shorthand term for somebody who decides to plead guilty in their case. They agree to cooperate fully and truthfully with the prosecutors. They agree to testify in the trials of all of their co-defendants. And that is what the reporting indicates Scott Hall did. So the shorthand term for that is a flipper.
Well, now that Scott Hall has flipped, is it more likely that subsequent co-defendants are going to flip?
Yeah, flipping begets flipping. I handled lots of conspiracy cases as a prosecutor, including RICO conspiracy cases. And, once that first defendant flips, particularly when that person is an insider, he is somebody who is a member of the conspiracy or a member of the criminal enterprise in a RICO case, it tends to get very real for all of the other defendants. This is why when somebody becomes a formal cooperating witness, when they flip, it is so incredibly valuable to a prosecutor and to the prosecution. Because what will happen is some of the defendants will opt to go to trial. They won't want to plead guilty. They won't want to accept responsibility for their own crimes. Maybe they're afraid to testify against their co-conspirators, their co-defendants, their criminal associates. So they will stand fast and they'll go to trial. But here's the thing. When those other defendants on trial are sitting at defense counsel table, maintaining that there was no conspiracy, there was no criminal enterprise. I don't know what the prosecutors are trying to convince the jury of. And yet you have one of their own. You have an insider. You have a member of the conspiracy or a member of the criminal enterprise who has pleaded guilty, who is testifying against his fellow co-conspirators. And that person is telling the jury, of course there was a conspiracy. I was a member. Here's the role I played. And you see those people sitting over there at defense counsel table. They were members of the same criminal enterprise. And let me tell you about the roles they played. That's why when somebody flips in a RICO conspiracy case, it is devastating to the other defendants. And that's why I'll finish where I started. Flipping begets flipping.
Now, is it likely that this plea deal would hurt anyone other than Donald Trump? Do you think that prosecutors would be going for anything other than the biggest fish here, which of course is Donald Trump?
It will hurt some defendants directly. It will hurt all defendants, at least indirectly. Here's why. So Scott Hall was apparently part and parcel of the, nefarious handling of the Coffee County voting machines. Those are charges that will directly impact Sidney Powell, who is one of the two co-defendants scheduled to go to trial late October. So he will probably have some very sharply incriminating direct evidence against her. But the thing is, he's going to be able to testify about other aspects of this criminal enterprise. And he'll probably have some direct information about what some of the other co-conspirators were up to. But even more importantly, it's almost sort of atmospherically incriminating of everybody because he is pleading guilty to 5 charges and he is going to testify, presumably, yeah, there was a criminal enterprise to try to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election in Georgia. I was part of it, and so were the others. So, this is going to end up hurting all of the other defendants who opt to go to trial.
Now, the prosecutors are recommending 5 years of probation for Scott Hall, so he won't serve a single day in prison. Do you think that he fared well in this whole thing? Do you think that that any of us would have expected worse for him, given his position in all of this?
He did fare well. So he was facing a mandatory minimum of 5 years in prison and up to 20 years on the RICO charge. There's some debate on whether there's some wiggle room in that mandatory minimum 5 years. But, setting that legal issue aside, he was facing some very real jail time. What he has agreed to plead guilty to, what the prosecutors are allowing him to plead guilty to, are 5 misdemeanors, so reduced charges, and they have promised that he will serve 5 years of probation. What does that mean? It means no jail time unless he violates the conditions of his probation. Then he could be incarcerated. So first of all, because I know what goes into plea negotiations as a former career prosecutor, rarely will I criticize the plea offers that other prosecutors extend to defendants. Why? Because I don't know what all goes into it. For example, if Scott Hall has sharply or directly incriminating evidence that he can provide, that he can testify about, regarding many of the remaining 18 co-defendants, that could be extraordinarily valuable evidence. So, I believe that DA Willis's team is up to the task of assessing what the appropriate plea offer is for somebody like Scott Hall, given the crimes he committed and given the evidence he brings to the table against others.
Well, given how on its face lenient this sentence seems to be for Scott Hall, do you think that that's another carrot for these co-defendants to get them to flip, that they'll see that they won't even serve a single day in prison if they get the same deal that Scott Hall was able to secure?
Brian, without a doubt. Ordinarily, when you have a grand jury indict a conspiracy case, any kind of conspiracy case, including a RICO conspiracy case, there is what's called the race to the prosecutor's office, because some of the co-defendants will want to get the first plea offer. Why? Because the first defendant in the door offering to plead guilty and provide truthful, accurate information about what was going on inside the conspiracy generally gets the best deal by far, depending on the nature of the crimes they committed as part of the conspiracy. So given that this first co-defendant in the door to flip is getting probation for all of his crimes, 5 crimes that he's committed, will absolutely provide incentive to the other defendants, and they might want to be the second or the third or the fourth one through the door to strike a deal with District Attorney Willis and her team.
To that point, the first trial up in this case is just weeks away with Sidney Powell and Kenneth Chesebro. Fani Willis's office has signaled that they may extend plea deals to either one or both of these defendants. Do you think that this flip by Hall makes it more likely that those two may accept it?
Yeah, it sure seems like Hall is very likely to have some directly incriminating information or evidence against Sidney Powell. Maybe not so much about Kenneth Chesebro, because he was, the architect of the fake elector scheme. But it looks like both Hall and Powell were involved in potential criminal activity regarding those Coffee County computers. They've been charged with things like computer trespass. So it seems to me that this is something that might impact Sidney Powell's decision about whether, the lift has just gotten significantly heavier for her if she goes to trial and tries to win an acquittal, a not guilty verdict. So she has got to be powwowing with her lawyers and thinking long and hard about maybe she wants to be the next one through the door to offer to plead guilty and cooperate with DA Willis.
Well, with that said, do you think that DA Willis would even be amenable to any type of a plea deal with Sidney Powell, given that she was a major player in all of this? I mean, Scott Hall is a relatively minor figure in this RICO indictment, but Sidney Powell doesn't occupy the same lane that Scott Hall does.
Yeah, great question. It's always a sliding scale for prosecutors. So how big a fish is the defendant that is offering to plead guilty and cooperate? How serious are the crimes against, the people of Georgia committed by Sidney Powell? And how much incriminating evidence can Sidney Powell give against bigger fish? Yes, it seems like Sidney Powell's crimes were pretty widespread and consequential. However, we also know that she was in the Oval Office on any number of occasions, and it seems like she can provide sharply incriminating testimony against the biggest fish, the big orange blowfish himself, Donald Trump. So all of that has to go into the calculation about what to do with Sidney Powell. Certainly, I can tell you prosecutors would want to bring her on board as a cooperating witness, but they're also going to want to hold her accountable for the significant criminal activity she perpetrated. So all of these things are fact-intensive decisions that have to be made by prosecutors. And let me tell you, Brian, this is an art, not a science. There is no playbook. There is no calculator that you can plug all of this evidence into and get out, the only one correct answer. So again, I think DA Willis's team is up to making these kind of really difficult calls.
Yeah, I can absolutely appreciate how much of a balancing act all of this is. With that said, we'll obviously stay on top of this stuff. So as soon as we have any new updates, we'll host another video. So if you're watching this stuff and want to stay on top of everything, make sure to subscribe. The links are right here on the screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.